So Matthew died, um, kind of foreshadowed at the end of the last chapter. Um, Lost all the money in the bank when the bank went out of business, and the shock killed him. Um, and that's hard. Nowadays, banks are a little bit different. There's something called the FDIC in the United States, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is insurance for banks, where the banks are forced to pay into it if they want to operate as a bank. And this insures all of their depositors up to $150,000. At least it used to be. I think it's still $150,000. While he thinks it's 200, it's quite possible it is. Anyway, it's some set amount. It used to be printed on the bank doors. FDIC insured all deposits up to blah blah blah. So, if you have less than that much money in an account at the bank, then the government will pay you if the bank fails. Um, Bank failures these days are fairly rare. Um, there were a bunch of near failures in 2008. And what they ended up doing was they merged a whole bunch of banks together. So there were a bunch of banks that were failing because of bad decisions. There were a whole bunch of bad decisions, which are really kind of difficult to explain. Um, Basically, what there were these hedge funds that took mortgages, which are, loans against houses, and they bundled them together. And they took a whole bunch of bad ones. And there was some fraud involved in this as well. Anyway, they gave mortgages to people they shouldn't have given mortgages to. They bundled all of these mortgages together and said, hey, if we have a whole bunch of these bad things together, it's actually a good thing because it becomes more predictable. In a way, it does become more predictable, but their predictions were off based on how bad it was. So, and banks kind of dealt with these things bundled together anyway. So there were a whole bunch of these, and it was kind of a hot potato sort of deal, or musical chairs, because it wasn't really a good position. And when people figured out it was bad, it's like my last thoughts. It's slowly and then suddenly. So things were going bad slowly, and then everyone realized they were going bad and sold. There have been a couple of movies made about this. Um, yeah, there have been a couple of movies made about this, some books written about this. But anyway, it was a whole bunch of bad decisions and a little bit of fraud. It can be argued how much was fraud and how much was bad decisions, but Hanlon's razor, never a tribute to malice, but can adequately be explained by stupidity. So, anyway, so they didn't have this bank insurance back then. And so, because of that, a whole bunch of people lost their money.
They're in Canada.
Oh, plus they're in Canada. Yeah, that's right. This is Canada. I don't know if Canada has something similar. It probably does. Because people trusting in banks is usually a good thing because that keeps the money moving around. Because if you take your money and you put it under the bed, then the money just sort of sits there. But if you take the money and you put it in the bank, it gets loaned to the store, and the store makes more money. He buys more merchandise, gets loaned to a factory. The factory expands, more jobs, more production. So people trusting in banks is a good thing. And so, I don't know if Canada has this or not. It, probably. Anyway, so bank failures. Matthew died. Um, and Anne couldn't cry right away. And grief is different for everyone. And grief is different for different times. Um, you're going to feel different when I die than when your parents die. And when one parent dies, you'll feel different than when the other parent dies. And never expect anyone to grieve the same way. Um, everyone feels these things differently. And so Anne was kind of in shock, which is a very normal thing. And then all of a sudden she broke down and she started crying. Once again, it's a normal thing. Um, so, oh, yes, Matthew's body in the living room. That's what they did back then. Before funeral homes really became a thing, you had the body displayed in the house, and everybody came by the house to see the body and offer their condolences. And so that used to be the thing. And they took Matthew away and buried him. And Anne put a rose bush on top of his grave. Um, so, so, so graves. Now we have, these graveyards where you have the stone headstone and you have the bodies buried and you had them laid out in nice, neat rows. But different places, different times have done different things. Um, but planting a rose or a tree on top of a grave was a fairly common thing, especially if you have a whole bunch of land. So, if there's a whole bunch of land and you don't really have to pack people in tight, then you would.
Was
then
he
you
in a cemetery or was he in a plot on his land?
He was in a cemetery. They said he was in a cemetery.
Okay.
Yeah, that's something else. Farmers. So if you have a farm and a family for years, you kind of have this family cemetery plot where it's like they go and they bury people and they bury people in this one area and they put like a flower garden there. And people fertilize the earth. And there's actually businesses that go and they do special uh, special burial where you take up an extra size plot and they plant a tree on top of you, and then you can have like a fruit tree and people can eat an apple that was fertilized by your body, which some people think is nasty and other people think is awesome. So kind of lean toward the awesome side on that one. um Hamlet. So in Hamlet, played by Shakespeare, you had the gravedigger talking with Hamlet, and he goes through this whole thing where it's like the king dies and the worm eats the king, and the peasant digs up the worms and goes fishing with them. So the fish eat the worm and the peasant eats the fish. So you have the peasant essentially feeding on the king because the king died and was eaten by worms, and the worms feed the fish and the peasant eat the fish. And then this was uh, repeated in The Lion King, where Mufasa gives this speech to Simba, young Simba, about the circle of life. And, it's the main intro song to The Lion King. Here is the circle of life. Anyway, so, circle of life. And, Mufasa said, when you die, you become the grass, and the gazelle eat the grass. And don't we eat the gazelle? Yes, it's a circle. And so it's a circle of life. And there's one more chapter left, and we will see more how Marilla and Anne deal with the loss of Matthew.